Hello everyone, welcome to another class of biology, and here we are going to discuss one of the most important chapters in class 10, and that is life processes. The subsection that we are going to discuss today is respiration in living organisms. As we know that respiration is one of the important vital processes in every living organism. It is one of the most important metabolic reactions. So before discussing about respiration, let us understand what are metabolic reactions or metabolism. So when we define metabolism, it is the sum total of all reactions those are happening in a living system. Okay, so this is the sum total of all reactions, and they occur in the living system. These reactions can be broadly categorized into two different types. One is the anabolic processes, and the second one is the catabolic process. Anabolic processes are the reactions which are called as a formative reaction. Okay? For example, look at this overall representation. Here are four different types of molecules. Okay, they are combined with each other to produce a complex molecule altogether. Okay, so something is getting formed in that reaction. So it is a formative step in which complex molecules are produced from a simpler molecule. Okay, and one of the most important feature of this process is that energy is used in such kind of reactions. Whereas catabolic step is a destructive step, okay, in which a bigger molecule is cleaved or is degraded into smaller pieces. Okay, so what happens here? Large molecules are broken down into small ones. Okay, so that is one of the most important feature of catabolic reactions. Okay, if you look at visualize the representation here, so this is a larger molecule. Okay, and the larger molecule is fragmented into smaller sections. If we look at here, okay, and such kind of reactions are called as catabolic reactions. And one of the important feature of such reactions is that energy is going to be released, okay, during this kind of reactions. So in the anabolic reactions, energy is going to be used, and in catabolic reactions, energy is going to be produced. Anabolic reactions form a complex molecule from a simpler molecules, whereas in catabolic reactions, a complex molecule is degraded into simple molecule. Okay, so let us look at as an example why respiration is called as a catabolic reaction. Okay? If we look at respiration, the overall reaction of respiration is followed this way. Okay? What happens here in this reaction, if you look at, so a molecule of glucose is oxidized in presence of molecular oxygen, and then it is degraded into smaller molecules which are carbon dioxide and water, and energy is released in this process. Okay, so a complex molecule which is glucose is degraded into simpler molecules like carbon dioxide and water, and that is why such kind of reactions are called as catabolic reactions. But if you have noticed about the reaction that we have studied in photosynthesis, what happens in photosynthesis? Carbon dioxide and water, okay, they react with each other and they produce carbohydrate or the simple sugars, which is glucose. So in that reaction, the reverse pathway occurs. Okay, and that is why it is called as anabolic reactions. So in anabolic reactions, simpler molecules are united to form complex molecule, and here a complex molecule is degraded to produce a simpler molecule. And this reactions, the respiration reaction, is simply called as an oxidation process, because in this process the glucose molecule is oxidized okay, and they produce carbohydrate and water. Okay, so this is the oxidation of sugar, and that oxidation of sugar leads to the degradation of carbon and carbon bond, because glucose is a combination of carbon and carbon bonds. There are 6 carbon atoms in glucose. Okay, that's why it's called as hexose. So these carbon and carbon bonds are broken down, and the release of carbon and carbon bonds. Okay, the when it is broken down, it is carbon and carbon bonds that releases energy in the form of. Okay. So here, simple sugar is called as the respiratory substrate. Why it is called as the respiratory substrate? Because this is the substrate which is utilized to produce the products which are carbon dioxide and water. That is why it is called as the respiratory substrate, because that is used as substrate in the process of respiration. But always simple sugar or carbohydrates are not the only source of respiratory substrate. When glucose is the most preferred form of respiratory substrate. But if glucose is not available in the system, or carbohydrate is not available in the system, okay, or available at a lesser quantity, then other molecules like proteins, fats, and organic acids can be replaced as a substitute for respiratory substrate. Okay, so always glucose is not the only respiratory substrate used in the living system. Therefore, okay, so let's move on. So let's look at the respiration that takes place in the plants. Okay, so for respiration to take place, one of the most important component that we need is oxygen, because carbohydrate has to be oxidized. And the oxygen has to be taken from outside. Okay, and the living organisms, most of the living organisms have developed a complex respiratory system or breathing system, so that they can acquire the oxygen from the outside environment. But now question comes, do plants possess such a kind of well-defined organ for breathing? The answer is simply no. They don't have a specialized, well-developed system like human being, that we have lungs, which helps in the breathing process. So the plants do not possess such a kind of well-defined organ system. And why is that? Okay. There are few important reasons why plants do not possess a well-defined breathing system. Because if we look at the plant parts, all the different parts of the plant, for example, the fundamental units of the plant, it can be defined as the root system and the shoot system. The root, the stem, and the leaf, all the different part of the plant system have access to oxygen. Okay, so they can get oxygen from outside, and they can release carbon dioxide to the outside environment. Okay, because they have certain systems that are in place in each part of their body, which can exchange gases with the outside environment. So that is the reason why they do not need a specific well-defined organ, because all their body parts are in constant touch with the external environment. Okay, so that is one reason. The second and most important reason is that plants are not in a great demand for energy. It is because of the fact that, okay, plants do not do any kind of movement. Okay, and one of the most significant amount of energy expenditure in the living system is due to the movement. Okay, and as animals move from one place to the other place, they spend a lot of energy, whereas plants do not spend that much of energy. Okay, so these are the two fundamental important reasons why plants do not possess a well-defined organ system for breathing and respiration. Then how do they do that? Okay, so let us understand the how, even if they do some kind of even as they do respiration, how do they exchange gases with the outside atmosphere? For example, look at the case of root hairs. Okay, the root hairs of the plant are in constant touch with the soil particles which are present below. Okay, and if you see, this is the structure of the root here, and the soil is here. Okay, and as the soil is porous, okay, so there will be a lot of air spaces here, and these air spaces would be quite oxygenated. So there will be a lot of oxygen in that airspace, and therefore the oxygen will diffuse into the root here, and the carbon dioxide, which is produced as a byproduct of respiration, will diffuse outside. Okay? The carbon dioxide will go out and oxygen will come in during the process of respiration. And from here, they will come to the epidermal cells, and from the epidermal cells, they will diffuse into the internal parts of the root system. Okay? Because as the internal parts of the root system consist of parenchymatous cells, which are loosely arranged, so therefore diffusion of gases is much more easier. Just look at a system like leaf, for example, stomata. So stomata are specialized opening which can close or open, and it is regulated by a kind of cells called as guard cells. They're named as guard cells because they help in the regulation of closure and opening and closure. Okay? And a phenomena called as turgidity of the guard cells, which helps in regulating the opening and closing, and which is of course a different class altogether to explain the mechanism of turgidity. Okay? So when the stomata opens, the gases can diffuse through this. And as you can see here, there are a lot of parenchymatous cells over here, and there are large amount of air spaces present. And through these kind of spaces and channels, the air from the epidermal cells can move into the internal parts of the leaf system. The same thing would happen in the root as well as in the stem system. Okay? So most of the living parts of the plant, okay, whatever the living parts of the plant, it's not present far away from the epidermis. They're present very close to the epidermis. So therefore, as they're present very close to the epidermis, they can get enough oxygen through the process of diffusion. And they don't need any specialized system for transport of gases. Okay, like we have RBC for transport of gases, they don't have a specialized system for the transport of gas. Okay. Similarly, the trunk of the plant, okay, the stem of the plant in the woody dicotyledonous plants, okay, so they have specialized structures called as lenticels, which are pore-like structures, okay, and these pores helps also in the process of diffusion of gases, okay. So overall, most of the parts of the plant is capable of diffusing gases with the outside environment. So they can take oxygen in and carbon dioxide out. Okay? So that is why plants do not need a specific system for breathing. Okay. I hope this is very, very clearer to you. Okay. So let us move on. Okay. So this is the overall process of respiration, which we have already discussed, where glucose is getting reacted with oxygen to produce carbon dioxide and water, and energy is released. Okay. But the question now arises, does this process remains the same for all living organisms? Okay. So we have diverse group of living organisms that exist in the universe. Okay. We have prokaryotes, we have eukaryotes. Okay. Do all the different living organisms follows exactly the same pattern or the same reaction? The answer for this is no. Okay. While some of the organisms which exist in the universe follow this pathway, there are many organisms which do not follow this pathway exactly. So they depend on glucose, of course, for breakdown and to generate energy, but the exact pathway might be slightly different from this. So there are broadly two different kind of reactions in which respiration takes place. One is anaerobic reaction, and then there is aerobic reaction. The aerobic organisms, okay, so the organisms which require molecular oxygen to do respiration. So they, in those organisms, this kind of pathway will follow, okay, where oxygen is going to be used for oxidation reaction. Whereas in other organisms, okay, oxygen is not used. So therefore that process do not lead to complete breakdown of glucose. Please remember this thing. Okay. In this process, the glucose molecule is completely broken down. For example, if you see here, glucose is a six molecules of carbon. Okay. And here 6 molecules of carbon dioxide is getting released when glucose is broken down. That means it is completely broken down. Okay. So this is called as complete oxidation. Okay, or complete degradation of glucose. Whereas in case there are some processes, okay, in which the complete degradation of glucose doesn't take place, okay, and therefore the amount of energy that is going to be released here in such kind of processes where complete degradation of glucose takes place is going to be much more higher. In case of anaerobic respiration, as complete degradation of glucose do not take place, the amount of energy that is going to be released is much more lower. Let us look at that. So that we called as the fate of glucose during respiration. The glucose can undergo two different modes of fates. Okay, either it will undergo aerobic respiration or it will undergo anaerobic respiration. So the aerobic respiration happens in the presence of oxygen. Okay, and this happens in the mitochondria. Okay, and here what happens? Carbon dioxide and water molecule is released and energy is released in the form of ATP. And usually 38 molecules of ATP is released in this process. And there are two different modes in which anaerobic respiration takes place. Okay? In one which takes place in kind of organisms like yeast. Okay? What happens here? In this reaction, ethanol is produced. Okay, so ethanol is C2H5OH. So this contains two carbon atoms. Okay, so this is not a complete degradation of glucose then. Okay, and it produces also a carbon dioxide. Okay, and energy. And in this process, only two molecules of ATP is generated. So therefore, it is much more less efficient as compared to the aerobic respiration. There is another kind of process that occurs in some living organisms as well as in our muscle cells, and that is called as lactic acid fermentation. In this reaction, what happens? One molecule of glucose will be broken down to produce two molecules of lactic acid, and lactic acid is a three-carbon compound. So therefore, if you see here, so two molecules of three-carbon compound, which is going to be six-carbon compound, which is one molecule of that is going to be. And energy is also going to be released in this process. And how many ATP molecules are going to be produced here? Here also two molecules of ATP is going to be produced. So both these two different kind of anaerobic reactions are much more less energy efficient as compared to the aerobic respiration. Okay. So if we look at the overall reaction, the first part of all reactions remains the same. Okay. The first part of all the three reactions remains the same, whether it is going to be aerobic respiration or whether it is going to be anaerobic respiration. The first part of the reaction in all these three different pathways remains the same. And the first pathway is called as glycolysis. In this pathway, the glucose molecule, which is a six-carbon compound, is broken down into pyruvic acid or pyruvate, which is a three-carbon compound. Okay, so if this is six molecules, a six-carbon compound, and pyruvate is a three-carbon compound, then how many molecules of pyruvate is going to be produced? Of course, this is going to be two molecules of pyruvic acid. So this becomes six-carbon compound altogether. Okay, and some amount of energy is also going to be generated here. Okay, so this is the overall process. So let us look at what is actually the glycolysis, the first step of the reaction which occurs in all the different kind of organisms which respire. Okay, so this is what happens in glycolysis. Okay, so glycolysis, if we just divide this terminology, one part is glyco, the other part is lysis. Glyco always stands for sugar. Okay, and lysis means breakdown. or we can say splitting. Okay? So the process in which the glucose molecule is going to be broken down into pyruvic acid or splitting of glucose occurs is called as glycolysis. This pathway is also called as EMP pathway, according to the name of their discoverers, Embeden, Meyerhoff, and Pranas pathway or EMP pathway. So, if you look at this reaction is a multi-step reaction. Okay, this is not a single step reaction in which just glucose molecule directly converted into pyruvate. It's a multi-step reaction. In higher classes you will study how does that multi-step reaction works. Okay, so glucose molecule by a series of enzymes, okay, because a series of enzymes will catalyze that reaction and finally produce pyruvic acid, which is a 3-carbon compound. Okay, as this is a multi-step reaction, so such kind of pathways or reactions are called as metabolic pathways. So metabolic pathways are the reactions in which are catalyzed by a multi-step pathway by different enzymes. Okay, so therefore glycolysis is a multi-step pathway. Okay, all right. So now the pyruvic acid under anaerobic condition will undergo 2 different types of pathways. We have just discussed some time before. One is the lactic acid fermentation pathway, another is the alcohol fermentation pathway. If it is a lactic acid fermentation pathway, what is going to happen? The glucose, the first step is going to be glycolysis, of course, which is 2 molecules of pyruvate. And pyruvate is going to produce 2 molecules of lactate, which is a 3-carbon compound. Okay? And no carbon dioxide is released in this process. Please do remember this thing. Because in all other forms of respiration, whether it's aerobic or anaerobic respiration, which is fermentation, in both processes, carbon dioxide is released. In this process, no carbon dioxide is released. Okay. And in case of ethanol fermentation, what happens? Pyruvate, okay, by a 2-step reaction process, it finally gets converted into ethanol. Okay? And carbon dioxide is also released in this process. Okay. So this is a 2-carbon compound. Okay, so 2 molecules of ethanol and 2 molecules of carbon dioxide is released in this process. Okay. So both these reactions, this and this, are very less energy efficient. Okay, because very less energy is produced, and we discussed that only 2 molecules of ATP is produced. Okay? And both of them, okay, both of these reactions produce some toxic components which are not good for those organisms which produce them. For example, lactate, which is produced by the muscle cells, okay, during the aerobic exercise. When we do aerobic exercise, high degree of aerobic exercise, okay, as the oxygen amount gets reduced and the energy demand increases, the body undergoes anaerobic respiration and it produces lactate. Okay, and that lactate is will cause soreness in the muscle cells. Okay, and that is why we get stiffness after a high degree of aerobic exercise. Okay. And the second thing, which is ethanol, which is produced by yeast, the ethanol itself is toxic to the yeast. Okay, and it has been estimated that at a concentration of 13% of ethanol, the yeast is going to kill themselves. Okay, if too much of ethanol is going to be produced, it's not good for them as well. Okay, so this is all about the anaerobic respiration. Okay, in which glucose molecule is catalyzed either production of lactate or ethanol, and a very less amount of energy in the form of ATP is going to be produced. Okay, and in the next class we'll continue the process of aerobic respiration, and also we'll discuss about the human respiratory system. Please go through this. Please share your comments, feedbacks, if anything, and we'll continue to bring such kind of lectures in the future. Thank you very much.